Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, Uni Youth. We're very happy to have you here with us today in the first of 3 webinars that Uni Youth will be hosting in the next coming weeks. And before we begin this webinar, we would like to express our solidarity for all of our workers who are today observing International Justice Day. We need to protect our workers. We need to listen to their demands. It's not just about clapping every night at 8 p.m. It's about turning out solidarity and listening to their demands and supporting their demands. So solidarity to all our workers out there. Now, as you know, the global pandemic of COVID-19 has been, without a doubt, one of the biggest challenges we have faced as humanity in the last decade. Lockdowns, social distancing measures, all of these to help flatten out the curve and to prevent the collapse of the healthcare systems have forced us into a social experiment of global proportions that we do not know its impacts until now. Some statistics alone show that in the US alone, 16 million people have started to work remotely as a consequence of COVID-19. And for example, in Japan, 83.3% of large businesses and around 51% of small to medium-sized businesses have introduced remote working as a result of the pandemic. But the big question is, how is this affecting us? Is this good? Is this bad? Are we ready? Do we need to set boundaries? Do we need limits? And what about young workers? What about unions? The purpose of today's webinar is precisely to explore all of these different aspects, and we have a very special set of panelists that will be joining us today. So we have with us today on this panel on teleworking and the right to disconnect, we have Alex Hochbach, who's the Director of Professional and Managers here at UNI Global Union. We have Sofia Escacerra from FAESIS Argentina, who's also the promoter of a new law in Argentina to regulate this. We have Jorge Maestro Carmona from Comisiones Obreras in Spain, and we have Brother Seiji Kujimoto from Nipporo, Japan. All of the panelists will be exploring the different aspects of the right to disconnect and teleworking. After the presentations, each panelist will do its presentation. After the presentations, we will open to questions and answers. You will be able to formulate your questions either in the chat or in the question and answers that you will see on the bottom of your screen. The documents that you will see throughout this webinar, they will be available to you through a link on Dropbox that we will post also on the chat later on. This webinar is currently being live streamed through Facebook at our Uni Youth Global page, and it will be recorded in the languages that we are interpreting in. Also, and this being said, let's start. So I would like to start by calling our first speaker today. Alex, would you like to take the floor, please?
Hey, hello everybody, and thank you, Martha, for the introduction. Let's just see if we can get my presentation on the screen and we can get going. I don't know if it's you, Martha, or Colin, who's doing that.
Sorry about that, Alex. Let me just get that on the screen for you. Apologies for that.
No worries.
Okay. So here we go.
Okay, great. Again, thank you, Martha. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation to talk with you today and present the work that we have been doing in Uni Professionals and Managers. And if you're not familiar, we in Uni P&M represent highly skilled or highly educated professionals and managers in all of these sectors. And in my presentation today, I will talk about the two topics of today, so both about remote work and the right to disconnect. And I also believe that Marta has already shared some of the papers that we produced. So that would be the guide to negotiating the right to disconnect that we produced at the end of last year, the update that we did earlier this year on the right to disconnect during COVID, and then a remote work discussion paper that we also produced earlier this year. So we go to the next slide. Marta, are you changing the slides? There we go. So the purpose of this paper was to serve as a background and provide some guidance for further discussions on remote work. So it's not a best practices document. Instead, what we wanted to do was to look at some trends and offer some of our initial thoughts on the subject, and at the same time invite our affiliates to submit their points of view so that we can further this analysis. And before the COVID crisis, remote work was already on the increase. And at least in Europe and North America, studies have showed that remote work and flexible working arrangements were highly sought after, and especially among young professionals. And there are good reasons for this too, as they allow for better work-life balance, better control of your time in general, there's no need to commute, et cetera, et cetera. And so with the COVID crisis, millions and millions of professionals and managers were pushed into remote work. And it's clear that we're going to see more and more remote work in the future. So what we wanted to do is to start looking at how we as unions address this question. So if we go to the next slide. So you can see that in the discussion paper, we highlight a few principles that we think are important to explore and for unions to talk to employers about and negotiate about. And again, these are conversation starters more than best practices. But we do, first of all, think it's important for companies to continue to offer remote work, and especially if they've done so during the COVID crisis. But at the same time, it's equally important that employers don't force it. So remote work must be voluntary, and it should not be used by companies as an excuse to close offices and save money. Because there are risks and disadvantages of remote work as well, and that's including isolation, lower levels of creativity and innovation, lack of spontaneous human interactions that you have in a normal office environment, and for some people, it just isn't a very good fit. So it's important that you have this principle of remote work being voluntary. Then the COVID crisis was very sudden. So we do have some understanding that not every employer was 100% prepared for this. But we do think that now that we have time and we can prepare, that we take the time to do so and make sure that we have good structures, policies, systems, and trainings in place for long-term and sustainable remote work. Similarly, we also think that there is a big difference between working remotely during the COVID crisis and working remotely normally, especially if you've had young children and the kindergartens being closed, and obviously that's been a major factor, but also just in general, the stress and anxiety from living and working in a pandemic. So we think there are some important learnings from this mass remote work experience, but we got to make sure that we don't equate working remotely during COVID and normal remote. Then we also think that in many places we need a new culture, a culture that is more inclusive, that values different forms of work, and where there's no penalty for employees who work remotely, who work flexibly, or who work part-time. And also when we talk about culture, we also think that it's important that we think about how we measure work. And so we can move away from a culture that exists in many places of presenteeism where, what matters is how many hours you spend in the office each day. So move away from that and move to a culture where we look at goals and outcomes instead. We also think it's important to look at issues of privacy. And what we've seen is that during the COVID crisis, many employers increased the amount of surveillance and installed some sometimes very invasive software to essentially spy on employees. So this is obviously a very important issue. And then finally, that we need to ensure that there is a right to disconnect, and I'll come back to that in just a second. And when we wrote this discussion paper, we didn't do it with youth in mind specifically, so I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on this. I do think that there are some additional drawbacks of remote working, especially if you're new on the labor market, if you're recently graduated and you haven't had the opportunity to be in a normal working environment to learn how to work and how to operate in a workplace. But again, look forward to more of a discussion on this later. Now, if we go to the right to disconnect, as I mentioned before, we published a guide to negotiating right to disconnect at the end of last year. And it is a fairly practical document that has best practices, that has an example text that can be used in bargaining. And that in general just includes some guidance for unions who want to negotiate a right to disconnect with employers. Because it's not necessary to wait for laws on the right to disconnect like we have in France or in Spain. It is something that we can start negotiating already today if we want to. And this guide, we have it in 6 languages currently, so you can find it in English, French, Spanish, Swedish, German, and Japanese. And if you haven't had a look at this document already, I suggest that you do so, as I'll just cover a few of the aspects in this presentation. And then you can go back and have a further look. So if we go to the next slide, just wanted to draw your attention to a few important elements of the right to disconnect. And one is highlighting the dangers of being constantly connected and the impact that has on our work-life balance, the impact it has on our ability to rest and sleep, the impact it has on our family and friends, the fact that constant connection can lead to anxiety, burnout, and depression. So this is something that is important to highlight to explain why we need a right to disconnect. Secondly, it's also important that there is no punishment for disconnecting and no reward for staying connected. And a lot of times in workplaces, there's either it's explicit or implicit requirement that workers stay connected after the formal working day ends. And that there are often negative career implications if you disconnect. So you don't get considered for promotions and raises and so forth. So this is a very important both cultural and organizational issue that we need to challenge. Thirdly, it's important when we talk about the right to disconnect to also look at the duty of others to respect that right. So the duty of others to not call people at night, to not send emails and messages at night. And in any case, when you talk about the right to disconnect, it's something that needs to be approached collectively. So it's not just the responsibility of the individual employee to enforce that right by not taking the calls, by not replying to people. So really important that it's approached collectively. Then we also need to define what are normal working hours and what constitute exceptional circumstances, because sometimes we really do need to stay connected to our jobs after the formal working day ends. But it's important that we define when that is and when we are expected to be working normally and can log out after 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. or whatever we agreed to. And then obviously also important that whatever policies exist are very clear There's training for everybody on the right to disconnect, that managers set good examples for their teams, there's monitoring of the policy, et cetera, et cetera. So again, if you haven't had a chance to look at the guide, I suggest that you go and have a look after this, this webinar. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we also recently published an addition to this guide on the right to disconnect, looking specifically at disconnecting during COVID. And the right to disconnect is always important, but especially when people work from home for weeks and weeks, months on end, and the line between working time and leisure time is blurred. It is really important that we highlight the right to disconnect here. And then to finish my presentation, on Wednesday this week, we will be releasing a new video to further promote the guides and the right to disconnect. But I wanted to give you a sneak peek of that video now. So I hope you enjoy it and find it useful. And again, it will be released formally on Wednesday. So let's go to the video.
Our phones allow us to stay connected to both times. Sometimes this flexibility is great. We can be on the go, at home, after our kids are in bed, or anywhere else we like. Being constantly connected to our jobs also has negative effects that can weigh on our relationships and our mental health. If left unchecked, constant connection can lead to anxiety, burnout, and depression. It doesn't have to be like this. Unions today are negotiating agreements with employers to secure a right to disconnect workers. A right to disconnect means you don't have to answer calls and messages after normal working hours or during the weekend, and that you're not punished for it. A right to disconnect means that you regain control over your time and your personal life. Uni professionals and managers has put together a guide to help you negotiate for the right to disconnect. Get your copy of the guide today and give your members the opportunity to recharge and balance their lives.
So at least on my end, it was a bit choppy, the video, but again, if you can wait till Wednesday, then you will get YouTube link and everything with it. So with that, I finished my presentation and look forward to questions and comments at the end. Thank you, Marta.
Thank you, Alex. That was really, really good. And thanks for all of the tremendous work you're doing. I know that there's already questions regarding the documents, so I just want to make clear for everybody that we will make all of the documents available in a bit on the chat. We will send the link so that everybody can access the documents that we are discussing throughout this webinar on a Dropbox link. So they will be available for everybody, and we wait until you do the official launch of the video, which is very exciting. And be sure that from the side of Uni Youth, we will be sharing it with the rest. So now that Alex just addressed, all of the basic concepts of what teleworking and the right to disconnect are, I would like to give the floor to Sofia Escacerra, who has been working on this issue, but she also addresses the visible and the invisible parts to these two issues that we're discussing. So, Sofia, te cedo la palabra.
Well,
Sofia has the floor.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to switch to Spanish so we use the interpretation and we have a more diverse set of voices here and different languages, which is one of the main assets of UNI Global, that we are all different and from different regions and different countries, yet we are in the same struggle. Bueno, cuando hablamos de
Now,
los efectos
when we
invisibles
talk
y visibles
about
del teletrabajo,
the visible and
gran parte de
invisible
ellos ya
effects of
fueron
teleworking,
tocados por Alex,
a lot
¿no?
of these have already
En
been
el
brought up
sentido
by
de que hay un
Alex.
montón de cosas que
Now,
son
there are
las
a number
que
of
trabajamos
things that we're
o
working
surgen
on
más
or
espontáneamente
which
cuando
come
pensamos en
about
el teletrabajo.
when we
La
think
realidad
about
es que el
teleworking.
capitalismo, y esto
The
es una
thing is
opinión
that
personal
capitalism, and this is my
como
personal
economista,
opinion,
está
and I say this
evolucionando
as
hacia
an
una
economist,
etapa de
is at the
capitalismo
moment we're
cibernético,
now
donde el
turning
capitalismo
to moving
cibernético
to
está comenzando
cybernetic
a poco a
capitalism.
poco
That is to
a
say
tragarse, a comerse el
that
capitalismo industrial, el
capitalism,
capitalismo
industrial capitalism,
más
is starting
tradicional.
to really
En este
eat itself to
sentido,
some extent.
ya han hecho inteligencia de los consumidores y de
Now,
los ciudadanos, ¿no? A través del Big Data.
citizens
Ahora viene una
know
nueva
about
etapa
this,
donde van a
and
empezar a hacer
now we're coming
inteligencia de las
to a
cadenas globales de
new
valor y de los
stage
trabajadores para
when
poder
we have
empezar a introducir
artificial
más
intelligence
inteligencia
in value
artificial y
chains, and we're
organizar de
going to
una
see
manera
the
más
use of this
eficiente
artificial
las cadenas
intelligence,
globales de valor.
and we're going to
En este
see this
sentido,
globally.
me parece que
So,
el tema de los
I
datos
think
a los
data
trabajadores, de cómo van
and
a vigilar
worker
los datos de los
data and how
trabajadores,
that's going to
es
be
sumamente
stored and
importante. Y el
used is something
teletrabajo
which
se
is very
presta
important.
a que esta
And I think
vigilancia sea aún más
teleworking means
masiva.
that there
Con
may
lo
be
cual,
even greater
muy bien
vigilance.
lo dijo
So,
Alex,
and I think, as
empezar
Alex
a
said
tener
very
mucho
well,
cuidado con el
we
tema de
have to
los
be
software de
very careful
vigilancia,
when we're looking at
con
these
este tema
vigilance
de que uno
softwares,
cuando
these
teletrabaja,
supervision softwares.
todo queda
We have
registrado
to
en la
be
web y por
very
ende
um,
es más susceptible de
careful.
ser controlado y
So,
vigilado
therefore,
por
we
parte
have
de
to
las
try and
empresas
keep
y de tener
a
una
careful
enorme cantidad de
control on
datos
this
que pueden
because
llevar
they
más
have to handle
adelante a
a huge amount of
algoritmizar las
data.
relaciones del trabajo.
And this is
Pero
something
bueno,
that can
vamos
impinge
a
directly on
las cosas
working
más visibles,
relationship.
¿no?
I think
Obviamente,
one of the
cuando uno
most
habla de
visible things,
teletrabajo y de
because when we talk
derechos,
about
lo primero que
teleworking,
surge
I
es
think one
esta
of the
cosa
first
de la
things that we see
infraestructura, ¿no? Que nos den
is
una
the actual
computadora, que
infrastructure.
nos den una
There
silla,
you
que
are
nos
given a
paguen
chair,
conexión a
you're given
internet,
a computer, you're
fijar
given an
horarios,
internet
el principio de
connection,
reversibilidad y
and
optabilidad,
I
que
think
sea reversible y
this
que
is a
sea
kind of
optable, que bien lo
reversibility, and
mencionaba
this is
Alex,
something that
que
has to
son
be
principios
optional as well.
fundamentales, que
And I think,
aquel
as
que
Alex said, this is
teletrabaje
vital. It
sea
is
porque
vital
quiere y no
that
porque
those who
lo
are doing
obligan,
teleworking
¿no?
have
Esta
to do it
cosa de
because they
que
want to do it, not because they're
realmente
forced
haya
to do it.
una voluntad del
And
trabajador
therefore has to
a
be a
querer
will on the part
teletrabajar
of the
y que
worker
cuando
to
el
work in
trabajador
that
quiera
way.
volver a su espacio de
And
trabajo,
when the
también
person
así
wants
lo
to go
pueda
back to their
hacer, que no
work
tenga que
area, they have to be
necesariamente
able to
ser una
do so.
opción
It doesn't
permanente en la
have
vida del
to be
trabajador.
something which becomes a permanent
Pero
option in
hay
their
algunas
life.
cosas que son más,
However,
yo les llamo
there are
invisibles,
some
pero no
things
son
which are
invisibles.
not
Son
clearly
cosas que por ahí
visible.
cuesta más
There
ver
are
y que
something
son
which are more
importantes empezar a
difficult
tener en
to
cuenta como
appreciate.
sindicatos que somos
And
para
I think it's
representar a
important
los
that we
trabajadores
concentrate
y
on
para
this
poder
as
empezar
trade
a
unions
negociarlas
so that we can
colectivamente a medida
actually
que el
start
teletrabajo avance
making this
cada vez
part of our
más, que
collective
evidentemente es
bargaining.
lo que está ocurriendo con la crisis del COVID.
And certainly this
Uno
is something
y
that we've seen
principal
particularly
son
during
el
the
tema de
COVID
las fallas de
crisis.
seguridad.
Now, first, we're
¿Qué
looking at
pasa si a un trabajador le ocurre una falla de
the
seguridad
security.
informática?
What
¿Quién va a ser
happens if
responsable?
there
¿La
is a
empresa o el
breakdown in
trabajador?
security? Who is
No se está
at
hablando
fault if
mucho
there
de
is a
capacitar a los trabajadores
security
para tener
breakdown? Is
una
it the
conexión a
worker or is it
Internet
the company?
segura o para que sus
Now, it's not
computadoras
just a
sean
case of
seguras.
having a secure internet
Por
connection or
ejemplo, si
having a
yo voy a
secure
organizar, soy
computer.
docente, voy a
For
organizar una
example,
clase a través de
I
Zoom,
might
tener
decide
en
to do a
cuenta qué cosas
university
tengo que hacer,
lecture,
como por
and
ejemplo
I
no
have to
publicar
know
la
there are certain things
password,
that I can't
no
do,
publicar la clave
not
y
to
demás, que son
publish
muy
the
importantes y que por
password, for
ahí no se
example.
está
And there are
diciendo que
certain
esto hay
things.
que decirlo, porque
And
después
I
si
think we
falla
have
la
to tell
seguridad,
people that,
van a
because if
querer
there
hacer
is a
responsable al
breakdown,
trabajador por esas
then the
fallas
worker is
y
going
eso
to
es
be
lo que
made
no podemos
responsible for
permitir.
that. And I think that's something that we
Otra
simply
cosa muy
can't allow.
importante, se habla
Something
mucho
else
de
which is
capacitación
important,
para el
we've spoken
teletrabajo.
about
Y
actually
muchas
training people for
empresas lo que hacen
teleworking.
es que
A lot of the
capacitan en
companies, what they're
herramientas
doing
informáticas, ¿no?
is
En que vos
they're
aprendas a
trying
usar
to
una
train people on how
plataforma,
to use
aprendas a usar un Zoom,
IT
aprendas a
tools,
usar
how
las
to use
herramientas
Zoom,
informáticas
how
que
to use
tenés.
other
Pero
platforms,
nadie
to use
habla
what
de
they have.
migrar
But
habilidades, de
nobody talks
migrar
about
habilidades,
migrating
que eso es
skills,
sumamente
though,
importante.
because that's also
¿Por
an
qué?
important
Porque
part
no
of
es lo
this.
mismo dar una
Because it's
clase
not
de
the same
manera
thing
presencial que
to
darla a
actually
través de
give a
la web.
face-to-face
Son dos
class
cosas completamente
and
distintas
something
que
else.
Sofía,
requieren, sí,
Sofi, disculpa, mil disculpas por interrumpirte. Es que
Sorry,
tenemos un problema con la
so
interpretación.
there's a problem with
Entonces
the
quería ver si
interpretation.
podías cambiar tu canal al español.
Someone, I think your
A ver.
channels change. Can you make sure you're on the right channel? Are you okay now?
Perfecto.
I think perhaps you were.
Gracias.
Can you hear the English interpreter?
Yes,
Is the
I can
English
hear
interpreter?
English.
Can you hear the English interpreter now? I think we got a mixed channel. Okay. So, as I was saying, we're talking about skills migration, and that's very important as well as part of training, because it's not the same selling something on the internet as doing it face to face. So I think there is a very different skills are required that have to be brought to the table when you're doing these different things. doing something on the internet is not the same as doing it when you're face to face. And therefore, it's very important that we have to understand that we have to migrate skills as well, not just kit and equipment. And it's important so that the workers have what they need. Now, it's, as I said just now, it's not the same as lecturing on the internet as lecturing face to face at the university. So there's not to just teach people how to use a computer or how to use a platform or something like that, but there also has to be this additional training. People have to be able to shift these skills across to what is now needed. And something else which is very important, and that is there is harassment, and women are very exposed when they're on the web. We know that there's a lot of harassment on the web, much more than you get person to person when you're present. And there's a serious problem on this because quite clearly, if you start doing teleworking, then quite clearly your telephone number, your email are going to be more accessible to people. And sometimes the people use false profiles to stalk or attack women. So I think it's important that we make sure that women get the protection that they need. And this is something very important, particularly in the environment of teleworking. Quite clearly. Now, I think looking at these skills, we also have to see this from a feminist angle as well, because there are women sometimes. Sometimes it's being used as an excuse to send us home. They say, it's up to you to look after the children. You can go home, look after the children, and you can really work from home as well. And basically, that is what is happening. Women are perhaps being sidelined to some extent. Is there still problems with the interpretation? Can anyone hear, can you hear the interpretation? Someone's saying that they can't understand the interpretation.
¿Escuchan el inglés?
I think, can you hear the English?
Yeah, I can hear English.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I can hear, and I can hear the speaker. It's fine. Now, I think we have to see this from a feminist point of view as well. And we have to take a feminist approach because we don't want teleworking to be something just to leave women at home and men go into work so as to sideline women from the world of work. So it's important here that we have to talk about this be optional. That is to say, someone can actually opt into doing teleworking, but they can go back to work when the time is right. Now, I think we have to see this from a feminist anchor, and it's not just a case of saying that women stay at home to look after the children and men go into work. Now, I would call these the slightly invisible sides. Well, they're not exactly invisible, but I think they don't spring to view quite as clearly as some of the other things that happen. You have to put a bit more effort into it to really see what these problems are. And we also understand that this migration of skills and security issues are things which are not always taken into account when negotiating the terms and conditions of telework. And I think it's important that we do this in trade unions when we're actually discussing this. It is important that we bear in mind these matters as well, so that we can put in place systems to protect workers and protect women, and that we can guarantee that there's going to be a long-term productivity this way, because otherwise it would be to the detriment of those who don't have the skills, particularly the more older people, for example, or those that have had less access to IT. Particularly in the global south, where we might not have the same access that you have in the global north to these. People might not be so one with work using a computer, or they might be in a system where they have an unstable internet connection and it cuts off. So I think we have to consider all of this, and I think we need this additional training so that teleworking does not run counter to the interests of workers when it comes from shifting those skills across. And something else which is very important, and that we have to have global strategies in this area. Someone's saying that they can't hear the Spanish, but I'm not hearing the Spanish channel. Now, Now, there might be social dumping. Now, people can try and undercut each other's conditions if we're not careful. And I think we have to be on our guard against social dumping. And that could even happen cross borders. That was what I have to say. Now, could you not understand I gather that there were problems. Were there, I don't know if it was problems with the translation or were certain problems. Yes. Thank you, says Marta. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, as you say, we're just reinventing everything again at the moment. So no, we've got a few teething troubles.
No, thank you so much, Sophia, for your presentation. And you've touched on a lot of topics that perhaps when we discuss these issues, which are relatively new to many of us, we don't take into consideration, what you've discussed about, privacy, about cyberbullying, about harassment online. These are topics that there has been a significant increase on cyberbullying and harassment and violence online as we tend to go into these new forms of work. And it's actually affecting the biggest number of people that are affected by them are minorities, such as women and LGBTI groups. So it was very relevant what you said, and hopefully we will get to discuss that a little bit later when we go to the Q&A. But Sophia just opened again the door to a different kind of topic, and it's how we are experiencing this from the youth side. How is this impacting us? What are the visible and the invisible impacts of teleworking and the right to disconnect? So I would like to give now the floor to Brother Seiji Fujimoto from Japan, who will be joining us, and he will be Japan is one of the countries in the world that has adapted most quickly to teleworking. This is something that they have been working on for quite a long time. And we want to hear from him, his experience in his own words, how this teleworking and this right to disconnect is currently affecting him as a young father and as a young worker. So, Brother Seiji, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta. Well, it is 9:30 p.m. in Japan. My name is Kogimoto, and I come from Nipporo, the Japan Broadcasting Labor Union. First, I'd like to tell you about my own experience. Can you actually hear the interpretation? Is that okay? Thank you. So I first started working from home at the end of March. At the beginning, I only worked from home half the time, and for the rest, I would go into work. But as the coronavirus took hold, the government of Japan declared a state of emergency, and then teleworking became the norm. I must say that personally, this was a very good opportunity. Online meetings, emails, and chats. We did not know how much we could achieve through these virtual means until we actually tried it. But it was much smoother than we had expected. Well, luckily, NHK, as part of its work style reform, had already started offering options of working from home. However, very few had taken it up. Maybe true with other countries as well, but especially in Japan, there was an embedded culture that work had to be done at a workplace, or presenteeism. However, this pandemic has thrown us all in at the deep end of teleworking. Many meetings were abolished or curtailed. We were given options of attending meetings physically or virtually. It has become very rare to travel a long distance only to attend a meeting. At times, access to the company system was difficult, and depending on my network connection status, my computer screen would freeze in the middle of a meeting. There were some hitches, however, the overall impression of remote working was good. What about the impacts on workers in Japan? Well, even if you feel a little bit sick, you do not want to put a burden on your colleagues. So a lot of Japanese workers still go to work. However, as the virus spread, it became a rule that you're not supposed to go to work. So the atmosphere very much changed. So if you do not feel good, then you should rest. But because you were given the option of working from home, I think it was a very good thing. And also, Japan has more than its share of typhoons, earthquakes, heavy rains, and other natural disasters. There are still a lot of people who would go to work through those disasters, but we do not have to risk our lives trying to commute to work. And we can mitigate some risks to people this way. And according to a survey, there's only about 20 to 30% of workforce who have experienced teleworking. Of course, the introduction is spreading. However, there are some people who can telework, but there are others who cannot telework, even in the same company. So you might feel you would like to telework, but cannot, and then feel that it's unfair that some people are. Also, as was mentioned, even if you can telework, and then your system allows you to do so, but some people actually prefer to go to work. So I think it is very important to respect each individual sort of options or needs, and also have a clear evaluation system. And also, how young generation in Japan feels about telework. Well, this is not just young workers, but a lot of people can have more time with their friends and relatives and also their family members. And also, I think there's an impact in terms of the residential conditions. It might be true in other countries, but in Japan, young people whose salary tend to be low tend to live far from work or choose to be closer to their work, although the space may be limited. But with the spread of teleworking, then you might be able to live further and then live in a big house, and then you might be able to concentrate further or better. On the other hand, there are some difficulties. So there was a survey about people who experienced teleworking, and then they found it sometimes difficult to see what the other person was actually feeling or thinking. Of course, Japanese people are not very good at openly expressing their emotions in the first place. But through emails and other online messages, it is particularly difficult to guess what the other person is feeling. And then these people might come under some stress. And also, even if you feel psychologically or physically ill, it may be easy to notice at work, but you may not notice such minute changes if you're working from home. And if you're a young worker and not experienced about how to cope with stresses, this could be serious. And because if it is teleworking, it could give you more time to learn more. But there is a possibility that the company will be reliant on you to find time to learn. I think it is very important that the employers and employees communicate further in the teleworking conditions. But around me, I think the young people, especially around me, are positive about teleworking, and they do not really have resistance to gadgets. And then there are some people who find it much easier to communicate virtually. And at NHK, we use a Microsoft platform called Teams for our communications. Its open chat functions let anybody participate wherever you're based and helps promote sharing knowledges and know-hows. And there have been cases where an employee in her 20s posted her opinion, and then a very senior manager who was based in a different region responded to it. So the platform is very flat. And what we can say is that learning and webinars become much easier on virtual platforms. So irrespective of where you live, you can participate in various kinds of learning opportunities. For young workers, of course, well, teleworking, there are some hitches, there might be some things to be ironed out, but for young workers to adapt to this kind of new environment is perhaps much easier because they are digital savvy. So to learn the skills of gadgets is much easier for them. And of course, you can live much further away because of the teleworking availability. So the balance between your work and family might become easier. And online, sometimes the abuse or harassment might become rife, and there was a mention of that. But in Japan, we have started education toward children about how to utilize effectively the digital. Well, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. That's all from me.
Thank you, brother. It was a very, very interesting presentation, and it was very interesting what you said. And just so all of our audience knows, Brother Sage is actually going to have to leave us because he has to go back to work. So before he leaves us, I wanted to ask one last question, if I may. And you spoke about, being digital natives. Young people are already considered to be digital natives. They're much better connected, they have a better use of technology. But do you think that this overconnectivity creates additional stress and additional mental health issues on young workers?
I think
it is possible, especially like young generation would like to be fairly evaluated and they would like to try hard. So maybe they are in a position to be able to check their emails 24/7, and then they would like to check it and they would like to reply. So I think some kind of regulation or rules might be necessary, like it was mentioned. For example, if it is late at night, a mail should not be sent or replied. At NHK, we have two different mobile phones for work and for private uses. And then the work mobile phone is left in your drawers, for example, in your office. Then, so even if younger generation might find it easy to adapt to this situation, this kind of regulation is perhaps necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being here and for sharing us with you. I hope that your evening is not too long and that you may be able to go back home and rest. And thank you for joining us today. Now, as Brother Seiji just mentioned, there is a need for regulation on these topics. There is a need to have clear rules on how to implement teleworking and to implement the right to disconnect. And this brings us to our next speaker, Jorge Maestro Carmona from Comisiones Obreras. Comisiones Obreras is one of the unions in Europe that has been working very closely on the topic of the right to disconnect and teleworking. And I would like now to give the floor to Jorge to explain to us how can unions help to regulate these kind of issues, how can unions help to support workers, and how we can help our workers adapt to these new changes. So Jorge, the floor is yours.
Hola, buenas tardes, buenos días.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on where you are. Good evening, even. I'm, as Sophia said, I'll speak Spanish to keep it diverse. I would like to avail of the opportunity to express our solidarity with what you're having at the United States at the moment and in other parts of the world. And I have got the LGBT Pride T-shirt. We are celebrating LGBT Pride. And I think this is a message we would like to send out to the whole world. Now, it's going to be very difficult to hold demonstrations, so this is our way of demonstrating to show our solidarity. COVID has changed everything, really. It's changed things for the better, for the worst. And now we see with what has happened, I'm from the financial sector, and in the finance sector, this was already very digitalized. There are other sectors which have less digitalization. So, of course, there would be a distinction to be drawn with teleworking in those areas where there was a digital tradition and where they were used to doing working online, working with computers, and where it might be a bit easy to make the change. And there are sectors where this has been something that has been forced upon them, really. They've had to move to teleworking. And they haven't had a lot of experience in this area, and they had to do this so that their economic activity could continue. But there was no particular regulation, no particular arrangements in place for them. Now, I come from the finance sector, which is very digitalized. So for us, teleworking came in, but practically all members of staff had to work that way, and also in the insurance sector. So there was a change because there was a certain negotiation on this, and I'd like to talk about those negotiations regarding telework. Now, one of the problems that we've had is that there are no regulations really, both in Europe and in Spain, which is part of the EU. There is no European regulation. There is no real framework here that we can use, which sets down certain guidelines and ideas or recommendations. We have nothing from the European Centre that we can actually use on, so that we can actually try and apply it to teleworking in each company. So this makes things rather difficult for us, because if you've seen that someone else might decide what the standards are, or there might be a complete absence of standards, and we might assume that there are companies which have goodwill and there are trade unions, but there are others though where, quite frankly, it's the Wild West. So, and I think this is a very common thing that we see, particularly in those environments where there is no trade union recognition, where they're not allowed in, where they don't have any strength. And if we look at those companies which are imposing certain working conditions, now often it simply becomes a case of might is right, really. So it's often quite difficult for the workers in those situations. Now, sometimes they might try and put this across to young workers as something which is really cool. This is something which is really trendy to be doing, working online, and they might try and sell it to them in that way. And and now, but of course, they might also try and give people the idea that childcare as well and family matters are just up to women. But of course, it's something that falls to both partners. So I think we do see, though, that women have particularly affected by this when it comes to telework. Now, so anyway, sorry, I don't want to get too much on this, bit of an aside issue on this, when I don't want to get too bogged down in that. Let's come back to what I really want to talk to you about. Now, it is important that we need to have clear rules, of course, so that in any change, any circumstance which affects workers, which affects how they work, then it's important that the trade union be part of that discussion. Because there's something which is very important, I think we know this, and particularly which is that in those companies where there are no unions, there are countries where you don't have a strong collective bargaining, then they ride roughshod over workers' rights. Things are not as good there, and I think there's no doubt about this. We might like it more, we might like it, but the thing is, where there's no collective bargaining, where there is no strong trade unions, or where people are not members of the union, then there is no bargaining, or basically people have very few rights. And the trade union is needed; it has to be there. And I think what is important, and we're seeing this particularly with teleworking, is because of the pandemic, we have seen that teleworking has suddenly come in. And the trade unions, there were people who were just starting to talk about it or didn't quite know what it was about, and we were caught a bit on the hop. So if we have to train people in this, and it is important that people know exactly what's going on, and we've had to learn very quickly. Now, we've spoken about the right to disconnect and how invasive this might be. You might be controlling the worker, what their working day is, or checking up on what they're doing. Now, I think it's important we have to have proportional measures. We can't accept that anything that can be given to us is given to us, and that they invade our privacy and that they invade our private life. So I think things have to be proportional here. They have to be proportional to the job that we have to do. For example, it wouldn't be if I'm, for example, I'm doing certain banking tasks and I'm given a telephone to respond to my clients. It's not fair that they use the GPS to check where I am. I think that would not be reasonable. So what I'm saying is that the measures which are going to be negotiated have to be proportional to the job in hand. And I think it's also important. There are certain things they try and slip in, which we might be try and sell to us as something which is good, but perhaps which isn't so good in the long run. We are opening up lines of communication as trade unions, particularly people who've been forced into teleworking, where there was no real area for them to discuss this. And there are no real standards either at national level or at European level. So we have been working hard in here, and we've had to really work flat out really to try and bring things together. However, I would say that in the banking sector, for example, or also in the insurance sector, we have managed to work. And I can give you some idea of some of the things that we've achieved, which might be a good idea for good practice for you as well. And certainly, we will be posting these. I mean, all our stuff we've got to be posting is in Spanish, I'm sorry, but I'm sure that you'll be able to sort out. And I hope, well, I'll just give you a quick rundown of some of the things that we've done. Okay. One of the very important measures that we've taken has been you have to talk about health and safety. That is to say, when we're actually looking at the health and safety at work, at the workplace, and we also have to bear this in mind at home. Now in Spain, it can be quite hot, for example, and we're getting into summer now. So a lot of people working from home are realizing that they don't have air conditioning at home, and they're not, and they're going to be sort of in the hot seat in more ways than one. So I think we have to bear in mind that kind of thing. Now, the second point is this, and I know that we've discussed this already, and there has to be a voluntary nature of this. And I think Sophia brought this out. Now, some you might think it's very cool and you're very happy to do it and you might be happy to go and work from home. But there are some people who don't want to work from home because they haven't got a place to do it, they haven't got room, or maybe other reasons. So I think that we have to have these agreements on a voluntary basis. There are situations which we have to bear in mind and we have to factor that into the discussions. We also have to think about, Sophia was saying, we have to think that if a person is working from home, they might have more costs. They have got their internet costs. They might be more electricity costs. Their bills might be a bit higher because they're at home all the time. And I think this is something that has to be borne in mind as well and compensated. This has to be also part of the discussion. There are people when they're working from home, they don't travel perhaps, but so a certain amount of money will be saved. So I think this is also be taken into account when looking at their pay and conditions. Now, as I was saying just now, we have to bear in mind that we work from a certain hour to another hour, a certain given time. That is to say, despite the fact that I'm at home, I can turn off my phone and that's it. The company doesn't have the right to communicate with me, and they shouldn't send an email, and this has to be recognized, that is my knocking off time, that's the time I finish work, and that has to be set. And I mean, unless something really unexpected happens, there's a real a problem, then they shouldn't contact me. And I think this has to be part of the agreement. I do not have the obligation to something that is sent to me by the company outside my normal working hours. I have my right to rest, I have my right to switch off, and therefore they should not be getting in touch.
A
And
ninguna
as
persona
Alex
que
said,
conteste la
it wouldn't be
comunicación.
fair for them to favor someone who does respond. And I think it's important that we have this in writing, that we have this guaranteed rest and a right that you do not actually have to respond, and you actually have written down, this is your starting time, this is your finishing time, and I think we have to make that as part of the right to disconnect. If if it's not properly regulated, then, and if there's going to be talk about flexibility, and I think this affects women more, and I think this means that it, in some ways all bets will be off. So I think we have to take this into account. If you have a period of work when you are available to the company, then this availability has to be well defined. I'm talking about senior management. Of course, they have to have an availability, and which is of course reflected in their salary. We also have to look at training so that everyone knows how they can use the technology properly. And they also have to have data protection training as well. If you're not properly trained, if you don't know that there's an agreement in place, and also you also have to know about respecting privacy, and people need to be trained so that people know exactly what standards they have to adhere to. And it's important they have to put in writing that the workers have a certain right to time off, and they actually have to quantify this as and I saw one of the agreements where one of our agreements it says that the company recognizes and undertakes to protect health and safety of people, and they want to avoid stress and IT fatigue. So basically, it is possible that there can be a kind of occupational disease that can come of this because people are online too much or because what is happening from home. And I think it's a good idea to have this in writing because there are people who can get sick because they're doing telework or there might be something else that caused that. And I think having this in writing means that they have that safety net, that they have certain advantages there, and that possibility is recognized. And another important paragraph that we've got in our agreements is that we have to avoid bad practice. That's to say, and particularly looking at young people. Now, it might look really cool that you're given a computer, that you're given this, you're given a phone, and you might think you're Jack the Lad because you've been given all this stuff, but not necessarily. So I think we have to be mindful of the fact that, okay, we work for live, okay, we work to live, but we shouldn't live to work. And I think it's important that we have a certain amount of moderation in how we work. Well, I hope that I haven't overrun my time, and I'm very happy to be with you today. And I'm very happy to field any questions there might be. Thank you.
Gracias, Jorge. La verdad
Thank you, Jorge. That was very good. And I think what you said was extremely relevant. And I think once we'll come to this when we come to the questions and answers session. But I think it would be a good idea just to finish with the panelists. Let's go back to Sophia. And I think you were talking about how they have taken measures in the unions regarding a collective agreement. How has this been covered in collective agreements? And perhaps Sophia could tell us what they're doing. Maybe she could speak about a national level. And I would perhaps we could close off with that. That would be a good way to close the panel discussions. Sophia, could you do that? Thank you, Martha. Yes. Now, in the Commerce Union in Argentina, we've got a board and we've got a senator, Daniel Llobera, and with him and with others, we've been working on these matters. And we have put forward two bills in our Senate, and they're starting to work on those. And the one on telework is, and also the right to disconnection is not quite as far ahead, but they're working on it. Now, it is important that you realize that UNI documents are very useful indeed. We have used these for both of these draft bills. Now, the one we had the right of to disconnect that Alex has been working on. Now, we used this and we were able to push this also from a collective bargaining, but for developing countries, particularly those countries which are suffering a crisis such as we have got a very serious economic crisis in that country, and sometimes negotiating things and getting to the negotiation can be very difficult. So what we did was put forward this bill, and we wanted to proclaim the right to disconnect for all workers, not just for teleworkers, but for all workers within the country, in the private sector. And we wanted to say that no one can get a benefit or a disbenefit because they're online or not online. And we said that this should be dealt with at collective bargaining level. That is to say, everyone should negotiate what they mean in their context of the right to disconnect. How do they see it? And also, this would be something that they would discuss with their company or with the employees' organization. Now, we wanted to put this forward last year to our parliament, but it was delayed and it was submitted this year. And there was a lot of public interest in this when we brought this to the Congress, because this was part of the discussion on teleworking and the pandemic. And this was the hook in which for a lot of people, but we wanted to explain to people, no, it's not just about teleworking because of the pandemic, it's more general than that. We said why we wanted to do this. We wanted to do this for reasons of vocational health and also mental health. And also we saw this as gender equality as well. This is a very important part of achieving it because it's women quite often. So if you're responding outside the hours of working is seen something which is a good thing to do. It's probably less easy for women to respond outside of working hours because we go home and then we're looking after the household. So therefore, stop this thing being as a kind of a skill that you offer as a worker. This should be seen as a lack of respect. So we wanted to try and put everyone on the same level there. We wanted it to be, in those terms, a level playing field. Now, perhaps a man maybe is who is less likely to be called for work or less likely to respond is also going to be a man who helps with the household chores, looks after the children, does all those things that you have to do at home. So therefore, we see this as a mental health issue and also a gender equality issue. And the members of the Congress were very interested in this. So there were some talks with IBM, for example, and also the teachers union as well. And they have been able to bring the right to disconnect into their collective agreements before the law has been approved. But of course, once the law has got through, we believe that this will come into a lot more collective agreements. So UNI, I would say, has done excellent work in terms of support and documents exactly explaining what it is and giving us certain standards for this as well, certain ideas. This has been very useful indeed. Very, very good work. Now, legislation is also being looked at on teleworking. That is on a separate track, but we're also wanting to include a right to disconnect in that, because if we don't get a law for the right to disconnect, then it's going to find that teleworkers are going to be very exposed as well. There'll be no limit to their working day. So it is important that legislation on teleworking should include a right to disconnect. And it is important as part of the infrastructure and part of safety, and also about the voluntary nature of this, and also the fact that home working has to be reversible. In other words, you can one day go back to your normal workplace. And also, we have put this into a very much vocational health and safety as well. And we've also varied questions such as safety at home, and also we spoke about trade union representation. And there's also an article which has been a bit controversial, but we've brought in, which is that a teleworker, if they're actually working across border, then the legislation should be, depend on where the person is resident. So he would have the rights which give the most rights. In other words, the person would benefit from the rights which give the most rights to the worker. They would have the option of getting the best protection. So the idea behind that is that we stop labor dumping or social dumping. So we don't want to race to the bottom here. So I think it's important that we do this so that we can keep up the standards. And because let's face it, teleworking is now happening, and we're also seeing that work is moving to parts of the world where the labor law is laxer than it is in some places. And as Jorge said, there are parts of the world where there are fewer trade unions, where there's not such protection, where the working conditions aren't really that good. So the right to disconnection is something that we're looking at the moment, and we're trying to do this for all workers, not just for teleworkers. We're trying to make it a very broad approach, and we are making some good headway here. And we hope that the right to disconnect is going to be worked up in the next few weeks because we're in conversations at the moment with some senators and with some members of parliament. Because as I've said, this triggered a lot of interest. And we hope the one on teleworking will the one will get through first because it's very important now. It's very topical because of the pandemic, and we want to leave people protective. Now, we're not really teleworking at the moment. You can just say that we're working from home in a crisis, but we want this to start becoming teleworking more officially. So we need this law, we feel, because we feel that that's going to change it, and we're going to be able to make sure that this becomes decent work as well. And this new law, will give us power in the work that we're doing. It'll give us a great support because we can see that this is going to be a working model that we'll see more and more of, and certainly it's been given a big push by the pandemic. So we believe that it's also important that we talk about the reversibility of this. That is to say, when the pandemic stops, the person's like, I don't like being at work, working from home, I want to go back to work. And they have to be able to do that. They have to have the right to do that. And as Jorge said, now there are certain people can't work at home. They don't have what they need at home to work properly. And also there is the gender side to this as well. How many men and women are who want to get out of their house a few hours a day, and that can often make a big difference to women. That can be the difference between life and death. So getting out of the house for a few hours, getting out of those four walls, it can be very important indeed. And people want to therefore go back to back once the pandemic has actually come to an end. Obviously not at the moment, but once the pandemic has gone, people want to be able to get out of their houses, and I think it's particularly important for women. It's very important, and but this should not be something which is imposed from above, something which they have to do. So, and also, there's also the question of privacy as well, that we have to respect people's privacy and private sphere. Some basically, the idea, some people are saying that the company should be able to come and check out your house. They can come into your home. And we feel that that is absolutely not on. We believe that it wouldn't be fair that companies come into your house. We believe that they have to respect your private sphere. Because a worker, you can do what you want at home. It is where you are. And therefore, no, you can say that your cows, they can come in, or they might, you might come into your house and they might see something, they might look at what you're reading, they might see that you've got a trade union poster up, and as therefore the idea of people coming to check your house, we feel is something that would be completely unacceptable. I mean, we believe that they should not do that. We have to make sure that people respect privacy, and therefore we are going to check this. But of course, on that basis, once we've got this law, it'll be easier for us to negotiate the necessary protection for the sector. And I wanted to stress again that UNI has done excellent work here, because this basic document that we got on the right to disconnect has been our guide, really. That has been our map in all of this. And I would suggest that you read it, that you use it, that you look at it and see what you can find in that paper which you can apply to the situation in your country. Thank you very much.
Mil gracias, Sofia.
Thank you very much, says Marta. And thank you very much for clarifying that. And thank you very much for filling us in on the pending legislation.
Sorry, Marta, can you just stop a minute? We've got no French interpretation.
I'll wait until you tell me it's okay. In the meantime, for those of you that can hear me and that you have interpretation, if you have questions and answers, I would like to ask you to please put them in the Q&A box that you see in the bottom, in the lower part of your screen, or on the chat box. We will we will open now the floor to questions and answers. So please write them down, and then we will proceed to gather them and ask them to the different panelists while we get back the French interpretation.
We haven't got it back yet, Marta. Just wait a second. If the French interpreters could just speak on the French channel when you're ready. Thank you. Okay, it's all back.
All right, so I repeat again, if you have any questions that you wish to ask any of our panelists, please put them either on the chat box for this webinar, or you can also go directly to the question and answers box that you see in the lower half of your screen. Now, I do have some questions to begin with this questions and answers part of the webinar. And I would like to start by going back to Alex. Alex, can you hear me?
Yep.
So Alex, the first thing we would like to know is the right to disconnect always linked to teleworking? I mean, we know that there's a relationship to it, but is it always linked to teleworking? Or can it be two separate things?
It's linked, but they are two different things. Because I mean, you need, even if you go to the office normally, and then you come home from the office and you check your phone and you check your emails at night, like that's a very, very common scenario that we had before, before COVID and before people were working remotely. So connected, yes, but we need to have the right to disconnect for normal circumstances and for remote work. So we used to say, for everybody, but what we wanted to do was to highlight, specifically when so many people were working remotely, that it is important that we have the right to disconnect. But yeah, it is for everybody.
The reason I am asking is because from the floor, we've received a couple of questions from different sectors where teleworking might not be an option. So for example, we have some of some of the people that are here with us today are either from the graphical sector or they are in the care sector. And one of the questions that came from the floor was, how can I telework when I have to be visiting patients every day? So that's what I wanted to ask you. And if you could clarify a little bit further about these two different topics, about the separation and how this impacts the mental health of workers.
Well, two different questions there. I mean, obviously, yes, we should maybe have specified that it's not everybody can work remotely, because some work or some jobs, by the nature of the jobs, require that you are in a physical space. So that's the caveat when we talk about teleworking and the right to disconnect for everybody, that it doesn't apply to every single job. I think what we've seen though with the COVID crisis is more jobs than we thought were able to be performed remotely, but we are still talking mostly about office work. So that's one thing. And then there's a question said about mental health and the impact that has, if I understood it correctly. Well, also different ways of looking at that. I mean, if we just look at the right to disconnect, there are quite a few studies that have established a clear link between constant connection and then, as I mentioned, anxiety, depression, and burnout. So that's always there. And then for COVID, I mean, you have other considerations too. But I think a lot of these, health implications can be avoided if you have clear frameworks and if you have clear understandings of, when am I supposed to work? When am I, supposed to be resting? And they seem like, sometimes a pretty easy thing to do, but it can be very important to really clarify. And I think Jorge mentioned this too, to clarify what are the expectations. And that was something that we also saw during COVID, was that people worked longer hours in many cases. So yes, people didn't commute, but then instead put those hours towards work, even though you have a contract that says, you have so and so many working hours per week. And that then, has also led to additional issues and people feeling more overworked, also more, you have more burnout. So again, a lot of different issues. And then, we respond to teleworking differently. Some people really like it. For some people, it's been very difficult. So, I mean, that's also things that you have to keep in mind. But again, to sum up, if we have good collective agreements, if we have good frameworks, very clear policies for how we're supposed to work, when we're supposed to work, and so forth, I think we can avoid many of the negative health implications that could come from remote work.
And there's actually another question for you that is coming from the floor. And this comes from Africa, from some of our affiliates in Senegal. The question is, there has been a number of our affiliates that have been working on different collective bargaining, that have different collective agreements on these rights. Some of these agreements have more than 10 years without being revised. And there's also the issue of how do we make them comply with the dispositions that are included into these collective agreements. So any suggestion, any idea of how we can make, the companies really apply these agreements that have been signed by the unions, been agreed by the unions?
Yeah, I mean, it is a bargaining issue. So, it is something that needs to be negotiated from the beginning, but also in terms of the implementation of the right to disconnect. And I think some of it also stems from the fact that it is a pretty new right. It was first introduced in national legislation in France in January 2017. So, and there are only a handful of countries that have a right to disconnect. So it is something that is pretty new for a lot of people, and that's something that we also wanted to address with the guide that we produce, and also now when we have the video coming out, also to show, maybe sometimes to our own unions that this is something that is important and that we want to negotiate about. And so I think, again, at the end of the day, it is a bargaining issue. If it's something that people feel really strongly about, and that is something that the union should then take up and enforce through negotiations.
Great, thanks, Alex. Jorge, I have a question for you now.
Listo.
Bueno, Jorge, también.
Okay, Jorge, just on the same line as we were discussing and addressing with Alex, how have you been conducting this collective bargaining agreement? What are the setbacks you've had, or the problems? What are the provisions that you included in the agreement to implement it? That's one of the questions. The second question is, what other issues would we be able to include in the negotiation, in the bargaining? You mentioned the ergonomic equipment, the screens, the chairs. What other elements should we include in this particular case?
Bueno, siempre cuando se inicia una negociación, me estoy oyendo con el... perdón, que se vea él. Bueno, siempre cuando se inicia una...
When we start the negotiation, we do it because the company has an interest in regulate something. We also have the side of the workers, but in this particular case, we need to do this, otherwise there would be no negotiation to be started. So when the companies realize they could have an option to make some savings, to save some bucks, the companies always go that way. They always want to cut costs. So they understood remote working as a possibility to save some money on these things because, well, they're saving on power, electricity, the issue of, commuting, accidents in the road. I don't know in other countries, but there are accidents that could take place when you're commuting from work or from the house to your office, and the longer the distance, the higher the possibility that you might have an accident. So companies usually mention this in terms of productivity. So that's how we start the negotiation. It is very important because so far with the technology that we have the capacity to do things that a few years we wouldn't be able to do because of the lack of internet connection in our houses and stuff. But what I think is important in this particular case that came out because of the pandemic, some of the companies that thought they had the muscle and the capacity to keep most of their staff working remotely, they now realize that this is not possible because the systems are saturated. everybody, I think you've noticed some companies were asking for audiovisual systems. They have no capacity to this. The services were overworked, and there was the system was were falling apart because there were too many people connected. For example, in the financial systems, if you have the service collapsing there, that could be a very big issue. So when we start the negotiations in this area, we need to consider what both parties are looking at. The company wants to save on costs. Workers need to preserve our rights. So what is the most important thing when we talk about remote working? Remote work is the fact that wherever you're working, from no matter where you are, you have to have the same rights as those people who are working at an office. That is the first element you need to protect. The second thing is, how can some expenses be compensated in the case of a person who decides to work remotely? This thing of the voluntary nature of the work is very important, because some companies might think they will be able to put entire departments to work remotely, and we have realized in some cases some people are being forced to work remotely, and this is generating very difficult problems. So this thing of doing it on a voluntary basis is very important. You cannot lose any rights vis-a-vis someone who's working at the office. And the third element I wanted to mention, something you talked about, is health and safety. Let me just give you an example of one of the agreements that we signed. It might seem a little absurd to you, but it says you are not allowed, you cannot take any calls while you're driving. It might be, ludicrous to put this on the agreement, but it happens. People who were working, they were going to visit a client, for example, and some of those people had accidents, in some cases deadly accidents, lethal accidents, because they took a call while driving. When you're driving, your capacity is diminished if you have to take a call. And at the same time, if within that call your boss is reprimanding you because you did something wrong, the capacity to drive is reduced in this particular case. So including this in an agreement to say, while a person is driving, you cannot call, you cannot interrupt that person. So that is one of the health and safety measures that need to be included, because it's going to benefit the worker. I don't know what else I need to say. I spoke a lot. Well, now that I'm asking you, there's a few questions for you here that I'm going to relay. This is from the Q&A section. First question comes from Norway. How can we consider that teleworking, working remotely, is voluntary under the pandemic? I think there was also a question regarding all the supplies that you would need to buy. How would they be paid? Well, the first thing, I want to address that one first. You can buy them and they need to be reimbursed. And the question on the pandemic situation, well, it's a very serious issue. At the very beginning of the pandemic, we had a myriad calls asking us, listen, my company is forcing me to work remotely. We don't have enough computers, and people had to use their own machines. Of course, I always say that when we have exceptional circumstances, you have to apply common sense. In other words, you might refuse to use your equipment. You have the right to do this for your remote work, because the company is always required to give you all the means that you need to work. But listen, this is a very exceptional circumstance, exceptional situation. Under the pandemic, I think no one had an idea of what had to be done. And there weren't enough computers. Of course, you didn't have any protective equipment at the time. Well, we have to use your ingenuity and do it. I think some of the companies are very bad, and some of those companies although they have the means, they don't provide them to the workers, but that's not the rule. At the very beginning, we had to use our own equipment to be able to resolve the situation in that instance. Well, that should not be the rule. That should be the exception. Right now, we are entering the situation of what they call the new normal. And if I continue working, it is up to the company to provide everything we need to carry out our work. And of course, not all work can be done remotely. Actually, some of those even could be prejudicial to conduct remotely. For example, a doctor who would need to go and see his or her patient. That is not possible to do it remotely. Some other works, for example, can be done remotely, but if you do not evaluate the risk situation and any risk to health and safety, and also the social aspect of it, we were talking about some illnesses that could get worse by working remotely. One of those would be with the situation of the lockdown, mental health issues could spring up and risk is higher of having this kind of mental health situation. Those are things you need to consider when you are actually working remotely. Mental health issues, stress, and things like that need to be considered in this particular case. I have another question for you, and it is coming from Japan. They ask, banks are working remotely very quickly right now. And for instance, the work for which 100 people would be required, now this work is being done by 10 people. They say, I think workers need to have this right to disconnect, but it is also true that the number of jobs will decline as companies adapt themselves to this new normal, to this new reality. How important are unions in this particular context, in this particular case? Well, unions are essential under this situation. I actually work in the financial sector, and in this case of Spain, over the past few years, we went from 150,000 workers in the entire sector to more or less 85,000 workers. That is a huge cut. And probably this is going to get even worse, but I believe that young people who are now participating will see that we see that if we go to a branch, we rarely go to a branch. Everything is done digitally, everything is done by the computer, and the same thing many people are going to be doing on ATM. They will not show to the at the branch. There are certain things that we cannot fight. I cannot tell people not to use the application. I cannot tell people to do that. But what we're doing as UNI is to preserve the highest number of jobs as possible, good quality jobs. That is the right we cannot lose. It is true we're losing jobs in the financial sector, and it might get worse. But it is also true that other jobs are being created in areas such as informatics, server maintenance, etc. So what we need to make sure is that to guarantee that these people who are now entering this field, these new jobs, must have, if not the better rights, even better rights than the workers that are in the financial sector remaining in the regular jobs. It is important that the works that might be lost some in one area, the ones that are being created in another area should have the same quality or even better. And they should have the same rights. And this is what we're doing in the financial sector as well as in other sectors. And UNI is displaying a huge effort in this area. Thank you very much for your answers. We have a lot of questions that I'll get back to you later, but I'm going to give a chance to Sophia. Sophia, can you hear me? Sophia? Yes, I can hear you. Okay, I have a few questions for you that I picked up from the chat. Number one would be, are there any other pieces of legislation throughout the world that are working on this right to disconnect? To be honest with you, says Sophia, I'm not sure. I know that in Uruguay, a bill was submitted that included the right to disconnect, among other things. I think it was on remote work and the right to disconnect they included in that bill. In my region, I'm not aware of any other. There's very little work being done because, as Alex said, this is something really new. Those who are the most advanced will be those countries in Europe, for example, France, Spain, Germany, through collective bargaining. I know that in Canada, there is the right to disconnect. I believe also in the States, in some cities, uh, in India. But I think Alex would have a better answer than me. I'm really not aware. I can tell you that in the Latin American region, there are very few cases where this is being done. I believe Alex would have a better answer. And the UNI document mentioned a few cases on the right to disconnect. Well, this is exactly what I wanted to ask you about. In the process that you are conducting, the work that is being done um, to to have a regulated right, I have two questions in the question. Number one, what is the major hurdle? What is the major obstacle for this to become law? That's the first question. The second question is, to what extent should this be a right that is regulated by government, or to what extent should this be negotiated through bargaining? Well, regarding hurdles or obstacles, since we are trying to legislate through a national piece of legislation, we have a political aspect that has to do with Congress. We have different voices in Congress, but I believe there is a quiet degree of acceptance that the right to disconnect should be a right in Argentina. We can hear from different sectors that there is the political will to at least address the issue, to negotiate it. And we need to make sure to that we all check that everybody understands the same when we speak of the right to disconnect. What I'm hearing is that the wrong interpretation of what the right to disconnect is, because some people say is the right to keep an eye on someone, to say, well, I will not answer your call. That's not the right to not answer, is the right to not get any message or any phone call. And this is usually related to remote work, but they don't realize that is this the right to every single work, from the worker, the construction worker who left the site and he's being called to say, where did you leave the cement? The other work that is hasn't even left the office, and he gets a call to remind him or her that he has a client tomorrow, that he has a document to submit, etc. So these are the two things that they need to take a look at. Now, regarding the bargaining agreement, the collective bargaining, I believe that the bill is there to initiate the debate to establish at least a minimum right. This is the right of all workers that is enshrined in the legislation. That is a very powerful tool that workers can use to bring it to the negotiating table. But if the union wants to negotiate it, they can do it regardless of whether or not there is legislation. But the legislation will help in the sense that it will be a requirement in the agreement. But the role of the union and the role to collective bargaining are essential for every sector and for every activity. It's not the same for every single person, but it should be. You have for people who have shifts and that they need to conduct. There are a series of elements that need to be communicated outside regular working hours. But I think it is important that it's a right that has to do with mental health. If we say at a company and say, in this company, there can be no communication, we are going to be affecting the mental health of the workers if we don't include it, because there will be no order in the communications within the work environment. So we have to do it gradually through negotiation, respecting what every single what it means for every single worker. Uh, what would be? I don't think it is a skill to receive calls outside the normal working hours. I think it is the right to be disconnected. I have to do it from the top to the bottom with different elements that will require us to do it, because otherwise change will not come by itself. It is obviously something that we can do gradually by respecting the individual singularities of each sector. This is the path to follow. And I think it is important that we are giving to the right to be organized, because the union, it is the one element that has the right to say what the workers need to protect their own health. So in this sense, unions have a very strong role to play, because it is not the same for every single sector, for every level of responsibility, and for the responsibility of all the words and the different legislations that they have. So I believe that respecting this element is very important. I think it is very important to guarantee the.
Pues precisamente esta respuesta que nos acabaste de dar, me parece que quizá puede ayudar un poco.
I think what you could do here is, and I've got a question here, is how can you make sure that those doing telework do it under decent working condition? Now, we're saying that the company shouldn't be able to go into the house to control what goes on there, to monitor the house. How do you get those good conditions? Sophia. Now, saying that the company can't go in is one thing, but actually making sure that the person is safe, I think, is a different issue, really. Now, you can't actually force someone to allow you into the house, but you could reach an agreement that the company can come in. Now, our legislation is trying to make sure that the worker can work under decent conditions at home. But as we've seen some of the questions in the chat here, they're looking at that we're looking at doing telework in other places. Now, it's quite possible that the worker doesn't have a place where they can work, and they have to be provided by their employer in another building, perhaps near to where they live. There might be a way to find that and come up with such an arrangement, but without having to cede the privacy of the worker, because the person should keep that right. All of us should keep that right, the right you have to privacy in your own home. I believe that guaranteeing that is not counter to actually breaking their privacy. I think you can make sure they've got good conditions without damaging privacy. And also, we have to try and look at how we actually judge risks. Now, Jorge was saying just now that someone's calling on my mobile phone and I'm driving, and that could well be an accident might be caused. So that is the kind of time when you shouldn't be calling somebody, you shouldn't be phoning them. So there can be diseases, there can be accidents, things that people can have, and I think there have to be coverage for those accidents at work. And I think this is a part of this. So they shouldn't actually damage the privacy of the worker, but certainly something has to be done to make sure that they are working safely. But I think this coming into the workers' home is the way to guarantee their occupational health and safety. We need to have an effective system in place so that we can give them the protective material that they need. That is important. So I don't think that they should give money for an ergonomic chair, for example. I think it'd be better for the company to buy them that chair, so that you would know that they have a proper ergonomic chair so that they can work safely at home without hurting their back. And then in this way, by buying it, if the company buys, you can make sure that the worker has what the worker needs. I mean, I'm talking about some of the fine detail of these of these arrangements. And of course, it's not everyone can negotiate such conditions. It's not easy in all countries. I realize that. But Marta. Jorge, could you just expand on what you were saying earlier about accidents? You know, now, how can you actually check these? If someone's doing telework from home, how can you actually monitor this? What happens if the worker, this is a question from, what happens to that person? What can we as trade unions do to try and make sure that it is a safe environment?
Bueno, pues
Jorge, thank you. Looking at a work accident, I think that is relatively simple. Well, in Spanish law, it says that everything that is caused by the working activity of that person, or which links to it, or is a consequence of it, then that is a work accident. For example, when you're going to work, because if I weren't going to work, then I wouldn't have had that accident that I had on the way to work. It might seem obvious to say that, but this has actually been tried before the courts. And it wasn't that easy, because if you leave things up to interpretation of a judge, well, you never know which way that judge might decide. And sometimes judges contradict each other. So when you're actually carrying out your professional activity, regardless of where you are, if you have an accident, then that's going to be considered a work accident. And therefore, this would have to be covered by the agreements, as we were saying earlier. If, for example, when they're phoning you, for example, and if you're in your car, or they shouldn't be allowed to get in touch with you as of a certain time. So this means that you have that right to disconnect and to live your life and to enjoy your privacy. And it's important that these be living agreements. That is, and what I mean by that is this, that they should be something which evolves as things evolve, because all of this is new for everybody. And quite probably, there might be circumstances when at first glance we don't see everything, and then people get more used to working from home, people are doing teleworking, and there might be certain things that we hadn't seen when we started working, and therefore these agreements have to be living documents so that you can take that into account, so that you can keep up with these developments. For example, in health and safety, it's important that they be living documents. So some of the pathogens, for example, so some of the conditions that you might get can also be factored into those agreements. And something that happens can be considered a work accident, because of course how this is dealt with differs very much, not only when it comes to prevention, because prevention work can be done if there might be certain diseases, and you can talk in terms of compensation and so on. I mean, I guess every country's got legislation in these areas, and something you might want to be classified as a work accident so that you've got that cover. Sometimes we want, of course, to make sure that people work safely and maintaining their health as much as possible. Thank you, says Marta. So I think this shows that bargaining is important, and these collective agreements are important. And I think this shows the central role to be played by the trade unions when it comes to reaching these arrangements. As Sophia was saying, you need a basic regulatory framework within which trade unions can operate. And then they can look at the actual fine details so they can cover these situations. And now, Alex, could you come back? Now, perhaps you could start to try and pull some of the threads together, Alex.
I don't know if I'll... Before we finish, I have a couple of questions for you that are coming up in the chat that are specifically related to you. So the first one is, as Sophia answered, like, perhaps you have any more examples of other countries that are working in terms of legislations adopting the topic of teleworking? That's my first question. The second one is regarding Do you think that teleworking is convenient for the formal sector? For example, just, we've been discussing about financial institutions, or is it also manageable in the informal sector? And finally, do you have any statistics on how the right to disconnect might have an impact on non-voluntary part-time workers, people whose life is controlled by their phone because they are waiting to get more work? So with those three questions, and then I will pose the last one, which is the question that is in everybody's mind right now. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. So in terms of legislation, I don't have a complete picture, but I know that in Europe, for example, in the UK, in Ireland, in Belgium, there's some efforts to legislate on a right to disconnect. And also at a European level, this is something that is very much on the table now. It's starting to come up both in the European Commission, and we also know that there's members of parliament that want to push for a right to disconnect in Europe. And I think linked to that is also a realization on the union's part, especially the European Trade Union Confederation, that we also need to update the legislation that we have, nationally and in Europe on remote working as well. So I know at least that is going on, and then there's some, we're hearing some chatter in different countries as well. Then the question regarding the formal, informal, full-time, part-time work, I think is more challenging. I don't know if we have any statistics on right to disconnect for non-standard forms of work. I think what we do have is, if you really go and you look at the gig economy, then there are statistics on how much time people spend just searching for work, let alone doing the actual work. So that we know that there's statistics on. But again, obviously, like it is more complicated when you move into more informal types of work. But what we do say though is that if you work part-time, that's something that I also mentioned in my presentation, is that you should have the same rights to remote work, to the right to disconnect as if you're a full-time employee, and that there shouldn't be a penalty for doing so. And that is important because, like, even just in general, looking at people who work part-time, there is a bit of a career penalty for doing so. If you look at people, say, coming back from maternity leave and working part-time, not having the same access to, to training, upskilling, to promotions, to other opportunities out there. So these are all challenges, but I think many of these challenges we can address in collective agreements. But I agree that when we do move into the more informal parts of work, like it becomes more difficult. Not impossible, but more difficult. Thank you, Alex, for that. And since we're closing now, we have the last 5 minutes remaining of our webinar. I would like to finalize by asking a question to each one of you, and it's regarding, and this is the big question that has been looming in the chat, is what does the future look like? Are we moving to a future where teleworking is going to become the norm? And do we need to start working more on legislating and bargaining on teleworking? And should we also start working on this from our global framework agreements? That's another big question in the chat. So if each one of you could give us, in 1 minute, your appreciation on this, we would be very grateful.
So Alex, would you start, please?
Oh, okay. I think we're definitely going to see more remote work. I think some of it will be positive, some of it will not be positive. I do think we will see employers taking advantage of it, closing offices, closing branches, and having people or forcing people to work remotely. I think you will have those experiences. But then at the same time, I think there also will be a lot of positive coming out of it. More employers seeing that it is actually feasible, more employees seeing and having experienced benefits of working remotely. So I think regardless of which way you look at it, we will have more of it. And that just, makes it, or means that it's more and more important for us as unions to negotiate on remote working, on the right to disconnect, and all these other issues, regardless of if we like it or not. So yes, definitely going to be on the upswing, and that's also something that you've seen if you look at the US, for example, and the big tech companies, how they are also more and more adopting remote work, like with Twitter saying that's going to be a permanent feature, with Facebook saying that up to half of their workforce is going to be working remotely in the future. So yeah, you will see more of it, and again, it's something that we need to bargain about as trade unions.
Thank you so much for that, Alex. Sophia, would you like to add? What is your vision on how this is going to affect us in the future?
I really think that the world of work is not sick of robotics and technology and digitalization. It's sick of fraud in the labor area or in the world of work. We have seen a lot of ways that the companies use to lower labor conditions, and it's not the technology to blame. Teleworking, obviously, it's a model that it's going to stay. It was growing before the pandemic. It was growing worldwide. And obviously, the pandemic pushed this further for it to stay. In this sense, what we were talking about being a person being able to reverse the situation or opt in the situation, it's essential. So this is not imposed for everybody. But anyways, it is a model that it's going to stay, and it's going to grow even further as the world advances and as we have 5G networks and stuff like that. About the global framework agreements, well, I think it's essential that we start having a teleworking chapter in the global framework agreements because of the issue that I spoke before, because we are facing social dumping. You can have teleworking transnational contracts, and you can hire workers worldwide, and you can use the low labor conditions to start doing social dumping between countries and to lower labor conditions worldwide. And in that sense, global framework agreements are a great tool to tackle this, to address this problem, so that the race is not a race to the bottom, but it's a race up, like to really increase the labor conditions worldwide for all the workers, among a company and among all the value chain that we have in companies. So yes, I think it's essential that we start working on this issue in the global framework agreements if it can be done. Because it's the only way to really help countries to tackle this and not make teleworking to become a new tool for transforming work into a less decent area of working, and to really put up the labor conditions for everybody worldwide.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Jorge, I am conscious of the time. Would you like to?
Jorge, estoy muy
add?
consciente del tiempo. ¿Quisieras agregar algo?
Bueno, nada, muy breve para terminar. Yo creo que el teletrabajo es una oportunidad inmensísima también.
This is an opportunity for us, for trade unions, because it's going to be looking at all these issues as well. And I think it will be able to use the tools that we have, these IT tools. And I think this is going to bring us much closer to people. It'll make our outreach much easier. We'll be able to use social media, for example. And we also have to bear in mind that when we talk about teleworking, it isn't just one thing. And we were saying we have to see the gender aspect of this as well. And we have to see that all agreements in the future, it's going to be important that we can talk about work in capital letters, but we have to look at the gender side of work as well. And there are a number of things that we haven't done yet, where we have to try and improve within our trade union organizations, and we have to try and improve our collective agreements. We want to try to modernize them, and I think this is a great opportunity that we're being given here. And I think it's important that we have to seize that opportunity. And I think we are moving very quickly now to modernize, and we're using the technology to do so, so that we can reach more people, people who need us and will need us in the future. Thank you very much indeed, and be safe, all of you.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Perdón, es que tenía cerrado mi micrófono. Disculpen ustedes que había...
So I just wanted to say to all of you, thank you so much for being part of this, our first Uni Youth webinar. I hope that everybody enjoyed it. As you know, as Jorge said in his presentation, you know, we work to live. We don't live to work. That's the basis of it. And we need to protect ourselves. And as Nick, in one of our affiliates from Belgium, just put on the chat, now more than ever, we need unions. This is the time for us to work on collective bargaining, to work on global framework agreements, to push for legislations that will regulate these issues and that will protect workers in all aspects of mental health, in work, that would allow us to lead better, more fulfilling lives. And with this, I would like to thank also our wonderful interpreters who have been here helping us out, to all of our team who is in the backstage who have made this possible. And to remind you all that our next webinar will take place on the 29th of June at this same time at 2 p.m. It will be on the topic of mental health, because we're going to be relating all of what we see in this webinar on the next one on mental health, and we will finalize with the last webinar on precarious work, which, as we all know, is affecting currently youth. So please stay on the lookout for the new dates and for the new invitation. And thank you everybody for coming and for being here with us. If you need anything from Uni Youth, you can see on your screen, you will find all of our social media where you can join us, where you can retweet, well, you can follow us. The videos for this webinar will be made available online. You have been given access to the documents on the Dropbox link. And if you have any questions or any answers, don't feel free to contact us. We're here for you, and we really hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, for our wonderful interpreters, and for everybody. Have a great day. Thank you.